I guess we have a lot of friends online as well, but thank you so much for joining us in person. It's a real pleasure to introduce to you Aynne Kokas, who is a C.K. Yen professor at the Miller Center and an associate professor of media studies at UVA. A fellow China specialist, Aynne and I have known each other for quite some time through a special program that the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations puts together, a public intellectuals program. I remember years ago hearing her give a talk on her first book, Hollywood Made in China, which I still assign to my students as a book that obviously very rigorously researched, but is actually a joy to read, which is not the case about a lot of really in-depth academic research. And so when Aynne came out with her now second book, I made sure to take the opportunity to have her come talk to us about it. Her work is not only policy relevant, but also tells me all sorts of things that I didn't know about U.S.-China competition. And given how much I know, I find that very surprising and very interesting. So with that, I'll introduce Aynne. She's going to speak for about a half an hour, and then we'll go into a general discussion. Thank you, Aynne.
Okay, great. All right, no problem. And so one of the things that's really interesting that happens here is you go through this process and you're like, how do I draw the lines for this project? And what I saw was that I was noticing that there were differences in how Netflix was dealing with the Chinese market and how a company like Disney was dealing with the Chinese market. Notably that Netflix was having a much more difficult time entering the market than Disney was. And at the same time, because I was working in Shanghai, I kept having difficulty with my internet and it kept cutting out and it was very frustrating. And as a PhD student trying to just get my thesis done, that was the worst thing ever. And I fortunately lived across the street from a group of friends who at that point had a VPN startup, a proxy server startup that they were running. And this was a foreign-run proxy server company that is now illegal in China and in 2013 became illegal. But at that time, they were still legally running. So I was able to actually work on my thesis and on my dissertation research from their offices. And so when I was doing that, I was talking with them about this Netflix Disney question, and their argument was, it's very clear from our perspective why there's this difficulty with Netflix's entry into the Chinese market. And it's because of the user data that Netflix is able to gather as opposed to what Disney is doing with their products. So that kind of shifted my focus. I continued working on my next book project, but then when I moved to Rice as a postdoctoral fellow, I ended up working with a cybersecurity lab on issues of data governance and data gathering through Sino-Weibo, and that kind of moved me into this direction. So here we are now, and it's interesting how the world kind of comes full circle. So as a media studies scholar, this whole question of whether or not of concerns about TikTok has really kind of pulled all of these issues together. And so it's an interesting time to be talking about these questions. So overall, the argument of my book is that that U.S. regulatory fragmentation combined with the data lust that we see in a lot of U.S. tech companies, as well as this kind of pressure to enhance shareholder value through greater data gathering, has expanded the Chinese government's digital realm. So one of the key points that I want to make here is that we see this really expansive vision of what constitutes digital sovereignty that emerges from the Chinese government. And I'll talk a little bit about the ways that occurs. But really the linchpin of the book is that this only works, and it only works from a commercial standpoint, if the US fails to actually regulate its digital landscape. So, a lot of this discourse in Washington focuses on the really expansive, anti-China rhetoric that, where we just see all these terrible things coming from Beijing. But the key point here is that if there were better digital oversight of, consumer data protections, for example, in the U.S., we would see an environment where this type of work was more difficult to achieve. Now, the other thing that I want to really foreground in this talk is this idea of talking about China and the China tech landscape. Oriana and I were discussing the balloon and the anti-China rhetoric surrounding the balloon, as well as a wide range of other different concerns in the Taiwan Straits. From my perspective, as a China scholar, and I know we have some members of the Public Intellectuals program from the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations here, it's really important to have very targeted discussions about what specific concerns we're looking at, and thinking about concerns related to the Chinese tech sector as very narrow, targeted issues related to specific Chinese laws and how they interact with the US policy environment, rather than kind of having a very expansive view that any kind of engagement with China is fundamentally problematic. Because first of all, that wouldn't work from a financial standpoint, and for the US to come out healthy and well with its economy. But also more importantly, it prevents actual targeted policymaking, because there are only so many interventions that we can make. So it's important to look at the kind of key issues. Now, I draw this idea in my book from a scholar named Pardis Madhavi, who wrote a lot about activism surrounding Iranian women's rights, and the challenge of talking about those issues within a US context, and how it's actually, on one hand, there are significant challenges in Iran, as we've seen with the protests. But also, once we move discussions of those challenges into a US context, it then becomes laced with questions of Orientalism and concerns, and overblown or potentially exaggerated concerns about the risks presented by Iran. So one of the key points that I want to focus on here is trying to identify the key areas of the Chinese policy landscape that present challenges and interesting points of intervention that also allow us to move away from a very broad anti-China rhetoric. Now, the broad concept of the book is this idea of data trafficking. And so what I argue is that data trafficking is an extractive process that exploits corporate user data via limited user consent or acknowledgement in order to gain government control. Now, this is the key distinction here is that we see a lot of data exploitation on US platforms, and this is a kind of foundation of the business model, and it's one of the reasons why the US has been able to enrich its tech sector, and we see this rampant growth in Wall Street, and here we are, this is a very salient place to be having this discussion. The key difference within a Chinese context are the levers that the Chinese government has to extract or pressure corporations to gather data from them, and the different types of pressure that we see both now and in the future, in potential future impacts. And a good example of this kind of present versus future concern that we can think about is the idea of golden shares, which is a type of Chinese government share taken from private sector firms. Now, in 2017, when I was doing research on this book, there was discussion about these golden shares being taken by the Chinese government from Alibaba. So I talked with the Alibaba head of government affairs, and I brought this reporting, and he, was very inflamed and was like, "Anne, I can't believe you would even ask me this question. This is not something that Alibaba would do. We're a private sector firm. This is, kind of fundamentally anti-China rhetoric." And I took that very seriously. Even though, living in Washington, when government affairs people speak, you have to, kind of always brag at things a little bit. But even so, I still took it seriously. And then in 2022, we saw the Chinese government take golden shares from Tencent, thus increasing the levers of pressure that they have over the firm. So when we're looking at these questions, we need to look both at what is currently happening, as well as the potential for future shifts in digital infrastructure. And so this occurred with both Tencent and Alibaba. And when we're looking at a firm like Tencent, it has huge investments now in the US gaming sector, for example, an area where we don't necessarily think about high levels of Chinese government pressure and oversight. But Tencent is also involved in China's military AI intelligentization process, which relies on these dual use technologies, which are often grounded in the gaming sector. Now, when we're thinking about this question of data, there are a lot of ways to think about it. And so since we're talking in a scientific context, I want to look more at the types of metaphors that we use, and the ways in which we can think about data as a grounding feature for this idea of the movement of power between different states. So one common metaphor for data is this idea of a new oil, something that we extract. And actually, I gave a version of this talk in Texas right before I came, and this was like the major feature was like, how is data oil, and how is it regulated in a way similar? But that's just one way to think about it. I think here we might think about it more in terms of infrastructure as the foundation for different AI tools like ChatGPT, and that data forming the foundation for new algorithms. We can also think about data as a type of asset. So one thing that my students are always shocked by when I tell them is that when companies gather your data and you sign it away via the terms of service and they go bankrupt, your user data can then be used by them as collateral or as leverage in their bankruptcy proceedings. So it's not just a thing that the company is extracting in order to make new products. It's also something that can be used, to gain financial leverage. So when you're thinking about making a deal with a company over your data, also think like, what's the likelihood that this deal is going to completely go bust when this company goes bankrupt? But the key point that I use here when I talk about data trafficking is not thinking about all of these features, but also about the very personal, intimate features of user data gathering now. So some of the cases that I talk about in my book are, for example, online dating through Grindr, the LGBTQIA social platform, which includes things like images, text, videos of very, very intimate interpersonal engagements. Things like baby monitors and baby monitor data that's networked and owned by Chinese firms. And there's a certain amount of this very personal characteristic that we see that's embedded in this process of transnational trade and the transnational movement of power. This becomes significant in a wide range of different areas in terms of being able to model communities, model behavior, in terms of being able to develop new products, to engage in counterintelligence and surveillance efforts, and to target mis and disinformation. So when I think about the word trafficking, I also engage in thinking about a couple of different ways that the word can be used. So one is this idea of drug trafficking. It's not a coincidence that when we think about drugs and we think about social platforms, everybody's a user, right? And we have a very hard time giving these things up. And I teach a class called the Data Ethics of TikTok at UVA. And as part of the class, we read all the TikTok terms of service. My students annotate it. We talk about all the things that they find problematic or difficult or things that they wouldn't normally sign up to. And then I say, all right, who's keeping it? And it's like 90% of the class is like, well, yeah, obviously it's a huge problem, but I still want friends. I still want to be, a part of this society. And so it's a very sticky type of product. It also is involved in, we also see this kind of multi-layered transnational trade system. When we think about this idea of human trafficking, that gets back to these ideas of the very intimate types of things that we share on social platforms. One of my friends was telling me about this time where she, joined TikTok and she wasn't sure what it would be like, and she wanted to see how quickly it could know her most intimate thoughts and feelings if she just gave all of the information. And she said it took about an hour and a half. So I mean, so the algorithm is very powerful in this sense that it's very, it understand, like different algorithms understand us very well. Then we can also think about this question of data traffic. So the movement of data, the more users that we see, the more efficient a platform is or an app is at actually enriching itself by drawing in new users. Now, I'm talking a little bit about TikTok here because this is a popular subject, but actually a lot of the apps and platforms that I talk about in the book exceed the social media landscape. So I look at things like gaming, agricultural uses, smart cities, finances, biodata. So these are not just a question of social media or entertainment platforms. the key point is that these become very much entrenched in our political discourse because they're things that a lot of people know about and they're consumer-facing technologies. It's a lot less interesting, and it works a lot less well as a rallying cry if you talk about the data gathering through precision agriculture, and then you have to explain what precision agriculture is and what data is being gathered and why that's important and what the long-term implications are. So that's one of the reasons why I think when we talk about these questions of data trafficking, we see it more in these social platforms, but actually it occurs in a wide range of different areas. Now, all of this relies heavily on network effects or network-based decision making, where users become more entranced and more engaged with different platforms the more that other users use them. Hence the data ethics of TikTok story, where the students just don't want to get off the app because that's the only way that they can socialize. Then we see an expanding user base, enhances user experience and retention. It increases the perception of a superior product offering. It attracts more third-party data sharing, and then leads to enhanced data trafficking. Now, all of this is grounded in the fundamental challenges of the US tech ecosystem. So when we think about the growth of data trafficking in a US context, it relies on the fact that network effects are undergird the entire US tech system, that data exploitation and lack of algorithmic transparency are foundational to the growth of the US tech sector. And this is one of the reasons why it's so interesting to look at this challenge, because when we see something like rallying calls to ban TikTok, it really doesn't address the foundational core of the issue. Banning one app doesn't change the fundamental dynamic between the US and Chinese technological ecosystems. Nor does it deal with the issue of larger questions of lack of algorithmic transparency or consumer data protection in the US. And indeed, that's one of the reasons why this has become a kind of popular solution. And I will tell you, once I published this book and started writing a little bit more about this, I got a lot of calls from public affairs people in US social media firms who were like, just wanted to talk with you about how we really support your thoughts on the problems that TikTok was presenting. And I was like, if you read the book, you would realize you guys don't come out that well. It's not that I see that this is a big TikTok problem. It's that there's a concern about these larger dynamics that really needs to be addressed. And a lot of this emerges as a result of fragmented data regulations in a US context. So when we think about where we see data oversight in a US context, there's Federal Trade Commission, Federal Communications Commission, Congress, the executive branch, the judicial branch, and all of these things are interacting, often without a lot of specific technical expertise in the questions and areas that they're addressing. And so this creates a really significant challenge, particularly when compared to the kind of long-term policy making that we see in a Chinese context. That's highly centralized, though not as centralized as the Chinese government might dream, but still has a very centralized vision, and also a very long-term vision of what a successful regulatory enterprise would look like. And so what I see in a US context is when we think about these data issues, we run into a lot of the same challenges that we see from the perspective of climate science or from dealing with climate issues. So there's a huge financial incentive to do very little in order to continue status quo growth in companies in the energy sector, for example, or in the tech sector. There's a huge emphasis on devolving these kind of collective action policy problems into individual choices, like selecting an electric car or monitoring your privacy selections on your terms of service, which actually don't address the larger ecosystem questions. So when we think about potential solutions, it's also important to think about this in a broader range perspective. Now, all of this interacts with China's cyber sovereignty policies, which are much more expansive and much more comprehensive than what we see in a US context. So I'm just going to talk about the kind of biggest hits here, the ones that are, kind of most shocking to people who don't look at this area. There's a lot more in the book and, a lot more granularity there. But the kind of key areas are things like the cybersecurity law, which was passed in 2017, which required all firms operating in China as well as all firms operating in China to store their data on Chinese government-run servers. So when we talk about something like Project Texas for Oracle or for TikTok, that's still a private sector firm that is storing TikTok data. In a Chinese context, that would be like a Texas state government Oracle joint venture, just to kind of give you a sense of the differences there. The data security law, which passed in 2021, which requires national security data audits for firms operating in China, as well as firms that are China that are affiliated to China. So this is where a lot of the ByteDance TikTok concern comes in. These national security data audits, as well as the provisions for online internet governance, which impose civil and criminal penalties for users, producers, and distributors of online content that may impact China's national security. So I don't know if any of you taught Zoom school or took Zoom school, or you engaged in this transnationally. So this was actually a huge issue for us. We had a whole group of students who were taking classes at Fudan University as UVA students, and they were, learning about things like Hong Kong and Taiwan and Xinjiang, and potentially violating the provisions in online governance as they were doing it. And these are the types of kind of expansive visions of cyber sovereignty that often get lost when we're talking about these questions. Now, this also exists in a context of regulatory asymmetry between China and the US, where we see that firms that can operate in China or firms that can operate in the US can't operate in China. And so a couple of weeks ago, I was at the Lunar New Year celebration at the US Embassy in China. And I was talking with a political counselor there, and we were talking about TikTok, and he was like, you know what, I think like the US just needs to chill out, and Project Texas is the way to go, and this is going to be great. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. I mean, first of all, a couple of red flags that apropos of nothing, this guy just started talking to me about Project Texas, but that's another question entirely. But then, I brought up to him, I was like, okay, well, let's say that this moves forward and that this is a good fit. How would the Chinese government respond to a US firm that had similar affiliations, or similar prohibitions as we see in TikTok on the export of the algorithm, or according to the Chinese government? How would the Chinese government respond to such a company operating in China? And how would that work from a trade symmetry standpoint? And the conversation ended very promptly after that, because even when we look at data protection questions, that fundamental difference in what is acceptable within a national tech trade context is very different within a US and Chinese context. But as we see in a tech context, a lot of US firms are still very actively operating within a Chinese context. So one interesting question that has come up recently is a lot of the discussion about whether or not there would be this national ban on TikTok, which I think is very unlikely. But let's say that it happened. One of the implementation mechanisms that was suggested was getting Apple to remove TikTok from the App Store. All right. So Apple makes a lot of money in China. Immediately after the implementation of the cybersecurity law, Apple moved all of their iCloud data from into Chinese government-run servers. The idea that this global corporation, which still has very large operations in a Chinese context, would take that action is very difficult it's difficult to conceive of, or what kind of levers would need to be imposed on the company in order to actually move that forward. So this is we see this kind of fundamental conflict of interest when even considering these efforts to move beyond data trafficking. And so what we see is that the power of US tech firms makes it much more difficult to actually implement any kind of regulations that would stymie data gathering by Chinese firms in the US. And we have definitely seen mechanisms, so things like the entity list, efforts like the Trump executive order and the Biden executive order, which requires more oversight of data gathering through the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. But a lot of this really relies on moving forward in politically tense as well as economically complicated territory, in ways that don't financially serve the companies that are involved, and now this is the other kind of crazy the crazy element of this. In the context of TikTok, it's also like you don't want to upset the influencers, right? Like nobody wants a tearful influencer video talking about how their career has been ruined, like, and they've got the beautiful makeup that's like streaming down their face. And it's so the people that you might now upset about these bans, like the more integral that that different platforms become, or in a precision agriculture context, even, you have the farmer who, now has to rip and replace a lot of the infrastructure that they're using to just, get their family farm to survive. This becomes like a very ugly and untenable political challenge the more that different firms become integrated into the US economy. But in a Chinese context, we don't see that happening at all, because when a firm isn't desirable or when they stop operating in the government's interest, we see, the levers of pressure are much stronger, which is why we now see, the Alibaba founder, Jack Ma, living in Tokyo. This is not a concern that a lot of Silicon Valley founders have to face and vis-a-vis the US government. So what I argue in the book is, I've talked primarily about the US-China context here, but this applies very broadly in terms of kind of global questions. And Harold and I were talking a little bit about this earlier, about the countries that are also caught in the middle. So most countries are choosing between Chinese and US technological ecosystems. Sometimes they choose one, sometimes they choose other, sometimes they choose both. But they have to contend with these different models. So when looking at these issues, it's not just a US-China issue, but it's how third countries respond. I spent the past summer in Japan as an Abe Fellow at Waseda University and spoke with a lot of Japanese policymakers. And it was really interesting to hear their perspective on this issue, because the consensus was, obviously, the US is our military ally. We have, closer ties. We have significant concerns about China. There are multiple examples of Chinese firms extracting data from Japan in violation of Japanese privacy laws. But also, China is very close, and there's a huge trade volume between the two countries. And the US model is also not really one that a lot of allies and partners feel like they can trust or rely on, and also one that they have experienced extractive data practices from. So when talking with European friends and colleagues, they point out that the GDPR wasn't written with China in mind. It was written as a result of concerns about the US. So there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of instability in terms of how allies and partners look at these questions. So I'm very interested. I know that there are people who are coming from a lot of different regional backgrounds and areas of interest. So I'd love to talk more about those questions in the Q&A, especially issues or concerns you've encountered in your particular areas of research. So ultimately, what we see is, in a global context, countries like Australia or Japan or Korea, or regions like the European Union, use the precautionary principle to mitigate data trafficking. So they anticipate what challenges might come ahead and try to manage those. By contrast, in the US, we take a more risk-based approach, where we allow for data to be gathered or used, or companies to operate, and then we try to pull back. What I argue in the book is that this becomes very difficult to do when different countries become integral to US technical ecosystem, US technical infrastructure. So, for example, the case of Huawei and Huawei's infrastructure in the US agricultural belt. It's great that there's now this effort to rip and replace Huawei technology out of concerns, but what this means is already underserved communities will then be further underserved because of this lack of precaution. Now that infrastructure needs to be ripped up and replaced. So when I talk about the book, I just want to give you guys, I want to flag a couple of different areas if you're interested and you want to go into greater depth, either in the Q&A or in reading the book. I talk about social media and gaming, health, which is actually one of the kind of most compelling and craziest and scariest areas. Different types of consumer products like like fridges and baby monitors and security cameras. And here's a little bit more if you want a few more op-eds or interviews. And I welcome your questions during the Q&A. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you. If you want to take a seat, we can open up for the discussion. And for those of you online watching, I am paying attention to the Q&A here, so please feel free to enter in. And before I turn over to the group, I have two questions for you because I am very single track minded.
Okay.
It's all about me. So these are my two questions for you. The first one is based on your discussion. I am definitely a convenience person.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
I'm like, okay, like I love how in certain places, like you scan my retina and I just go. I love all of that. I don't live in China. So
Right.
should I care? Like I get like their government has more data and can control their population, and that's kind of difficult for them. But when I hear a lot of this talk, I think, okay, don't live in China. And then I get the misinformation.
Right.
But I feel like I'm very smart and nobody can trick me.
Right. Okay.
So if I don't live in China and I feel like nobody can trick me,
Right.
how bad is it? Like your students, when they're like, well, I actually am not on TikTok, I'd like to pretend it's for security reasons. It's mostly because I'm like not cool enough to figure out how that works. But I'm not on those platforms. But if I wanted to be, like, what would you tell an individual who doesn't have the concerns of like the Chinese government control or misinformation about this issue?
All right, so there are a couple of different layers to this. So on one hand, we have this question of the kind of surveillance issue, which I think about as the ick question, because everyone's like, oh, I don't want to be like surveilled. That sounds terrible. But as you point out, this is not a significant issue for a lot of people. We have seen that there are reports of, for example, surveillance of journalists. A lot of state governments are trying to remove TikTok and WeChat from their state networks and devices, which makes sense from a just anticipatory cybersecurity standpoint, because a lot of those organizations don't have enough technical support if they had, for example, phishing attack or malware attack that emerged from one of these issues. But then there are the kind of collective action concerns which take on a bigger role. So there is the question of more subtle misinformation. So knowing about you and being able to target and guide your opinions. And so this is a really interesting area because this is actually also one of our colleagues and friends, Maria Repnikova, has done work on this in the Chinese newspaper industry. This idea that there are things like censorship or suppression of information, and then there's more subtle opinion guiding, where just knowing about you and being able to subtly shift how you frame an issue, which I would, given your areas of expertise, I would, assume that would not impact you. But most people are not scholars of, of China's, information and surveillance state. Now, those are the kind of individual level issues. But then this is really interesting when we think about the collective issues of economic competitiveness and economic security. So a company like TikTok emerged because Chinese firm ByteDance was able to acquire Musical.ly, which was a U.S. social media video platform, primarily for kids producing different videos, and then was able to integrate that with the user data that they gathered through their social platform DrawIn. And so then that created a stronger product, which then could be sold globally and now has over 1 billion users around the world. So when we look at a context like that, and also 25% of people under 30 get their news from TikTok. So when we think about that, this becomes a question of economic security and the stability of critical communications infrastructure. Then there's the question of things like the development of products and services for a longer term period of time. So more sophisticated AI that relies on being able to access global markets and the Chinese market as well. And then we can also think about questions of dual use technology. So this idea of Tencent and military intelligentization. So Tencent's global involvement with gathering user data and developing new algorithms through its gaming platforms, but also having related entities that are involved in AI intelligentization for the Chinese military. And the gaming and military dynamic is also something that we see in the U.S. I don't want to undermine that connection here, but the difference is that there's much more of a private partnership dynamic, whereas in a Chinese context we see something like golden shares of Tencent and more in-depth forced collaboration through things like civil military fusion. So when we're looking at these issues, I think that we can look at them on an individual level, but it's also important to look at the questions of economic security and political security in terms of the development of new products in this context of trade asymmetry.
Well, thank you for that. I have a lot of questions coming. I'll turn to the room first before I go online. And if you can start by introducing yourself before you ask the question. And we have a mic coming around for our online users.
Hi, my name is Julie George. I'm a predoctoral fellow here at CSAC and at the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Thanks so much for your talk and for your book. I have a ton of questions, but I'll just save it to one. I'm really interested in hearing you expand your thoughts on GDPR and what we could potentially learn from it and the recent Digital Services Act about content moderation, about privacy and transparency, especially as you noted that this isn't simply just a US versus China, but there are other countries that are also impacted by technological proliferation.
Right, and this I think is a really important question. And so when we're looking at things like the GDPR and Digital Services Act, one thing that we can see is that the response of the European Union is not just to China or to the US, but is a response to extractive data practices from both countries. And actually, in some ways, we can say that we can observe that the Chinese government and Chinese firms have actually been more careful in terms of following those laws than we've actually seen. We've seen fewer lawsuits against Chinese firms than against US firms in respect to especially GDPR, which has had a little bit more time to play out. And so this is at the crux of why this becomes a really significant challenge, because there is not necessarily a strong consensus between countries that would typically be democratic allies and partners as it relates to these issues. And we've seen statements from leaders in Brussels and in Germany, basically making the case that they're less concerned about China than about the kind of long history of data extraction by Silicon Valley firms. And from a US standpoint, the US is actually in a uniquely beneficial position here, because the US has tech companies that are domiciled here and can bring people into Congress and force them to testify and maybe regulate them through Federal Trade Commission suits. And obviously, these are quite ineffectual, but compared to other countries, there's at least some possible response. And so what we're seeing more of is alliances and discussions between countries like Korea and Japan and Australia and the European Union in response to the US and China.
Right. Mike, did you?
So my questions is just to expand on that. I'm Mike McFall. I work here at FSI. Tell us what the ideal solution would be multilaterally. Just give us, if there are no politics involved, what's your solution for the fragmented, story that you told that would make the world better off?
Yeah.
And then the second question is, how do you break the alliance between the tech firms here and the Communist Party of China, which, I know some of these tech firms pretty well. They're investing a ton to keep the status quo, right?
Yeah.
So first tell us where you would want to go, and then speculate if it's ever possible to get there.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And maybe I'll take the second question first. So in the last chapter of the book, I talk about the challenge of dealing with these issues and using this metaphor of climate change and the challenge of addressing these collective action, yet also economically driven problems, that I don't think that it's feasible to have a clean or pure solution to this. So I use climate scientists Pakala and Sokolow, who have this idea of climate wedges, where you take existing potential narrow solutions and try to combine them in with a larger strategic framework. So and so what they call those is climate stabilization wedges. So I talk about the idea of data stabilization. I don't think that we're ever going to stop data trafficking, or there will probably always be firms that find a way to develop a really creative corporate structure, or transfer funds, or collaborate in different ways. And also, I don't necessarily know that this is a great idea to stop that type of collaboration, but I do think that there are important ways to mitigate the most extractive versions of that. So things that I propose are SEC oversight of data sharing, sort of. So if we think about user data as a sort of financial resource, then a greater oversight of how that data is being shared and transferred. Limitations on data brokers. So one of the things to your point, does it matter if I use these services? Well, not only is it that a platform like TikTok could use it, but there could be purchasing of your data can also be sold, and then combined with, like, if, for example, if you were the subject of the OPM hack or the Equifax hack, and then that can all be combined in a really robust picture of your financial and government service profile combined with your interests and preferences. So data brokers are a key area. And I go into depth about working more closely with allies and partners to the degree possible in areas where we can. So for example, something like CPTPP, which actually has a data governance framework in place that the US pulled out of, and now there's a debate about whether China or Taiwan will be able to enter. I mean, more engagement in areas like that seem to be kind of low-hanging fruit where it would be possible to move forward. Now, what the ideal multilateral solution is, this becomes a really interesting question, and I'm really glad that you asked it, because on one hand, there is this idea that maybe states do have a fundamental concept of digital sovereignty, and the U.S. has really pushed against that largely because the U.S. has financially benefited from states not having digital sovereignty. But we see a wide range of different countries that are taking an interest in this model, from India to Russia, to China, to Vietnam, and also countries like Japan haven't necessarily asserted this idea of digital sovereignty, but they have been slowly establishing digital borders through things like their privacy laws and data adequacy agreements with the European Union. So I think it's a really interesting area. And one of the reasons why I was fascinated by doing this research is because it's not that we can completely break this down according to like, oh, this is an authoritarian or a democratic model, or this is a powerful state versus a weak state question. It's really about readjusting and reconsidering what the boundaries of the state are in the current moment. And I think actually in the moment of the balloon, since we're talking about the surveillance balloon all the time, even though we may not even want to be, one area where we also see, and this is actually where Oriana's work has been really transformative, and where I'm extremely grateful that I've had the chance to learn from her, as in working on this book, is that we see, and in her article on foreign affairs on China as a stealth superpower, and in her forthcoming book, we see that there are many domains where China is actually expanding its definition of what constitutes national sovereignty in areas that are fuzzy. So space would be one area, maritime considerations, the Arctic, and I think digital sovereignty, or as the Chinese government calls it, cyber sovereignty. I didn't use that term on the front of the book, so it seemed like I would be, I would be adopting the Chinese government stance a little bit too strongly. But that's another area where this fuzziness is very beneficial.
I'm going to turn to an online question from Herb Lin, who's a senior research scholar for cyber policy and security here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. And he asks if you could address how China's being ahead in the data collection game has direct implications as a threat to US citizens, and in particular, China's gathering of data on American citizens through apps like TikTok. If I can add on from an anonymous person, very relevant attendant, in your answer to this, can you say anything about how, if the United States and China, our relationship improved, that would impact your answer?
Yeah, definitely. Well, also, so Herb, I've interacted with him in different online forums. I haven't met him in person, so I really respect his work, and I'm glad he was able to.
This is even him.
Yeah,
maybe you've never met him before. Who knows?
All I've seen is his avatar. It seemed like the type of question he might ask, but so a couple of points that relate to that. So we've seen it. So we're already in a really interesting moment, and I think actually here the WeChat case is even more interesting, where there was this Trump administration efforts to ban WeChat, and there's also kind of continued scrutiny of WeChat even now. But what we see is on one hand, there's dissemination of disinformation and misinformation in Chinese, especially on WeChat. So there's that like mis and disinformation question, and then there's also the element of WeChat's essential role in terms of the U.S.-China economic and social relationship. So while on one hand, the Trump administration and now various state bans and considerations in the federal government are looking at WeChat, we also see that one of the reasons why it was protected from the Trump ban was because of the First Amendment, First Amendment protections of WeChat users who wanted to be able to continue their business and social and family ties to China. So when we're looking at this kind of role of critical communications infrastructure becomes integral, because there's this dynamic where if we pull back from using WeChat, then it can kind of fundamentally challenge U.S. The U.S. and Chinese digital ecosystems. And I see one finger.
Oh no,
Oh.
he's just adding to the
Oh,
list.
just adding. Oh, okay, great. And then like if the U.S. relationship with China improved, would this be less of an issue? So I think it would be less concerning, but I think also as long as China's laws still maintained the same level of extraterritorial oversight over Chinese tech firms, then these considerations wouldn't go away. So I think the potential negative impacts may decline, but that violation of or pressure on national sovereignty wouldn't disappear.
All right. Sorry, now I'm keeping a list. So I'll go to Scott, Graham, and then Mason.
I was going to say, and Mike was not very transparent. I work at FSI. I work here at CSAC. And I know your first book very well because my son wrote his honors thesis on Hollywood's efforts to penetrate the Chinese movie market.
Oh, wow.
And you were cited more often than anybody.
Oh, I feel very honored.
I want to know how the surveillance that you're demonstrating and the information firewalls that China has influences public opinion there. Should we be totally skeptical of any polling because of this? I was heartened, for example, after the start of the war in Ukraine, that some clever German researchers used a line item survey experiment, a list program, in order to measure real opinion as opposed to the ones that were surveilled. What is this? How should we interpret polling that's coming out of the PRC, and should we be totally skeptical because of the phenomenon that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I think this speaks to a challenge that I know we've discussed a lot, which is, so for my first book, I was able to do a ton of in-person field research and like interpersonal interactions and asking people in-depth, research surveys after we got to know each other very well. And now those same people, even if I go back to them, even after, a longer relationship, because, I haven't been able to go back to China since COVID, though it seems like the doors were opening as of up until Friday. We'll see what happens after that. But those same relationships are now all mediated online. So I have a lot of respect for for my colleagues in political science and their ability to do surveys and to kind of try to dig into what public opinion really means. That being said, I think that we're really at a disadvantage right now when it's not possible to do these kind of same in-depth, in-person interviews that might back up any survey data, largely because we've seen more cohesion or like a less dissent in public opinion expression, especially among government officials, for example, following Xi's ascendance. And it's also much more difficult to get kind of granular, nuanced responses when everything is tracked. And not only is it that things, like if you're doing something over WeChat, for example, not only is it that your conversation is documented and you lose access to WeChat, but you could lose access to your bank services or your ability to move freely or your ability to, to pay your utilities. I mean, so it's
Which is probably on 10 cents or something like that.
right.
anyway, so, yeah.
So the stakes are extremely high for, expressing dissent on a digital platform. So I have some not small skepticism, though I do, I do really respect and honor the work of colleagues who try to kind of dig into that, particularly in our difficult environment.
Well, thank you for your talk and for your book. I'm looking forward to reading it. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned, the question of what the U.S. position would be on the scales of sovereignty, whether data or cyber or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking of the TikTok example, which is front of
Right.
mind for me, obviously. And if you consider three scenarios, there's TikTok goes on as usual. I think we can probably agree that's unlikely. There's TikTok gets banned completely, which you mentioned you think is probably unlikely. I agree on First Amendment alone. It just seems really hard. Or there's something like Project Texas, their arrangement, and that comes with data storage in country. It comes with government supervision over data access, whether it's adequate or not, and government supervision over algorithm auditing.
Yeah.
Whether it's, enough or not. My question is, how do you view that as, were that to go forward? Is that essentially a cyber sovereignty or a data sovereignty approach from the United States?
Yeah.
And I mean, if you have an opinion on whether it's a good idea, I'm happy to hear it.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, it's really interesting because I think we are seeing the U.S. assert a sort of, but I mean, I think we are seeing the U.S. assert digital sovereignty, but I almost don't want to call it that because it kind of fits within this fragmented. I think and it's not because I don't think that it's a digital sovereign move. I think that it's too narrow to kind of consider it an idea of sovereignty, because if the US's idea of digital sovereignty is just to like ban according to public opinion and or like apps that are identified as being potentially risky, not necessarily based on a full-scale risk assessment, but based on just like what rises to public attention. And I think this is like, when we're talking about the surveillance balloon, this can be like another example where, we have this really high level of attention on this one risk. But if you look at the entire scope of like the risk of US-China relations, maybe this wouldn't be our main area of focus, but it has risen to like popular attention. And as a media studies scholar, this is something that's very interesting to me when we see things being targeted just because they become popular or, a subject of public discourse rather than a kind of larger kind of more systemic concern. So I think that we are seeing the US do more to protect its digital sphere, and not just through things like Project Texas, but through things like, putting companies like Huawei on the entity list, and limiting financial transactions. So those are already occurring. The key thing that I always get stuck on is that it doesn't seem like there's a broader effort to define like what constitutes digital sovereignty in a US context. And I think that in many ways, this discussion gets stymied by the fact that there remains a sort of ambivalence about whether or not that's useful to the long-term economic interests of the US. Now, whether or not Project Texas would work, I have serious concerns, and largely it's not about what Project Texas would be necessarily, but about all the things that are not covered or might not be considered. So, for example, there was recent reporting that TikTok's financial arm that's working with JP Morgan is, that the person who's in charge of that relationship reports directly to ByteDance, which isn't necessarily part of the Project Texas dynamic, but would be of concern. And so I think one of the challenges here is, would any kind of a deal actually encompass the entire scale of risk? And what would the kind of long, and if a deal is set in 2022, but the tech industry or like TikTok's ability to gather user data expands over the coming several years, how does that work? And an interesting kind of example that I use in my book is the case of GE Appliances, where I visited GE Appliances, which is a subsidiary of Haier, a Chinese consumer appliances company, when I was in China on a U.S. congressional staff delegation. And we didn't even really want to go. They just kind of like, we went to Qingdao and they were like, oh, you're going to go to Haier because this is one of our big companies. And we went, I was actually hoping to go to the film studio, which we did, which was great, which was very interesting, but actually a complete ghost town. So it was kind of a bust. Then we get to Haier and the people at Haier are like, well, we would like to welcome you to our data company. And I was like, wait a second, this dorm refrigerator company is now a data company? This is quite fascinating. And they took us through their entire like digital ecosystem for the home and how they were thinking about the home as a new operating system, and that they would use GE Appliances as the the famous brand that would help to guide this home operating system, and Baidu would provide the back end for this home operating system. And I was like, whoa, this is a really interesting turn for what I was expecting from this visit. And the key point here is that we don't think about like, that moment where a refrigerator becomes a home operating system is a difficult moment to assess. And so when we're looking at a social media platform, or at a different app, like at what point does it transform and start to gather other things and become a bigger concern? So
All right, we have 2 minutes left. Are you ready for a lightning round?
I love a good lightning round.
Okay. We've got, I have one online question, and then I'm going to go to Mason, Harold, and the gentleman here, and we're going to ask our questions very quickly. And then Harold says he doesn't even need to ask us.
Okay.
He's going to bother you later. He
Okay,
feels
great.
confident in his ability to bother you later.
Okay, great.
They'll be very quick, and then you get to decide whether or not you want to answer them
Okay.
or talk about something completely different. So
Wow.
first we have a
So empowering.
I know, right? Postdoctoral fellow from CSAC, Karen. She asked about whether it's a good analogy to think about these data companies, these tech companies, like the mercantilistic companies of like the colonial age, like the East, like the trading companies that for their own economic interests determine policies of countries. And then who did Mason, you want to go ahead and.
Yeah, thank you. So really quickly, so to me, because I studied the regulation over digital trade, trading in digital products and services, and to me, this is largely a important but essential, important but a byproduct of this dearth in the regional as well as international levels of regulation over digital trade and trading products and services. But to me, collective action is one thing, but what I've heard from those who are involved in these negotiations is that it's more of a matter of deliberate inaction on the part of countries, including the US. So, and they ascribe this to largely what you brought up, which is this like uncertainty in the digital technology itself, where countries, including the US, do not want to lock themselves in a situation by negotiating a set term of, this is what we want to do, without realizing they might be the beneficiary in the next, they could be the beneficiary in the next round. So I just want to hear whether that tracks with your observation, and if that is the conundrum, which seems to be a pretty tough one to me, what could be a way out from your perspective? Thanks.
All right, and then last question of our lightning round. Have your competitive tendencies make you ask it more briefly than me?
Yeah. So Ian Reynolds, fellow here at CSAC and HAI. I'm just wondering what you think about what your presentation means for our concept of sovereignty. Does it need to be reconfigured? It sounds like the boundaries don't really apply, even in the context of these old colonial mercantile things. So as scholars, where sovereignty is so important to us, do we need to kind of reconfigure those boundaries? Thanks.
Now, living the biggest question for last.
Yeah. I love
it. Okay, bring us home with a final everything we need to know.
Right. Yeah, so I would say that we definitely do need to reconsider what we think of as sovereignty, including not just digital landscape, but also other areas that are being contested that Oriana talks about in her exciting forthcoming book, including the space race, maritime issues, the Arctic, and I think that the great thing is there is for those of us in the ideas business, there's a lot of work to be done here, and a lot of it emerges as a result of this kind of this idea that Nathan brought up about deliberate inaction on the part of tech companies who are reluctant to actually assert any of these boundaries, or even try to advocate for specific terms because it's unclear what they might want to ask for in the future. And I think this does create a big challenge. And that's one of the reasons why in the conclusion of my book, I don't say like, and here is what digital sovereignty should look like, because I don't think that it's a, first of all, I didn't feel comfortable like making that assertion given what we know now. Also, I don't think that it's feasible to actually come up with a one size fits all definition, which is why I came up with this idea of data stabilization, where different countries pick different mechanisms that they can use to stabilize data trafficking rather than to completely eliminate it. And then with regard to Karen's question, I think this makes a great deal of sense. And actually, there's someone who blurbed the book, Adam Siegel at the Council on Foreign Relations, who is writing a book that's talking about tech companies as the new digital East India companies, and how this type of involvement in trade has led to like new definitions of sovereignty. So I would actually direct her to his work where he goes into that analogy in greater depth. How was that? How did I do for time?
You did great.
Thanks.
Yeah. Professor of communications. I mean, I think that's really sealed the deal here. Well, Aynne, thank you so much for joining us here at Stanford. Thank you to the in-person audience, the 46 people online. And of course, if this has sparked your interest, go out, grab the book, and enjoy the read. Yeah, thank you.